Good evening and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. My name is Ladaris Cordell, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt, Professor of Psychology at Stanford University and author of Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Dr. Eberhardt has been a member of the Stanford faculty for more than 20 years and is the co-founder and co-director of SPARQ, S-P-A-R-Q, a university initiative that uses social psychological research to address pressing social problems. She has worked extensively as a consultant, and her groundbreaking research has helped law enforcement agencies and companies like Airbnb and Nextdoor address the issue of bias in their business practices. In 2014, Dr. Eberhardt was awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant. I also should add, she's also appeared on Trevor Noah's show. It's awesome. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. Did I pronounce it right? Did I pronounce it right? Eber, right? And not
Jennifer's fine.
All right. All right. Okay. So, welcome. I have read your book twice because it was that engrossing. So, at the beginning of Biased, you write, "This book is an examination of implicit bias." You go on, "Implicit bias is not a new way of calling someone a racist. In fact, you don't have to be a racist at all to be influenced by it." And you finish, "Implicit bias is a kind of distorting lens that's a product of both the architecture of our brain and the disparities in our society." So let's talk first about the architecture of our brains. You conducted a study that was the first to demonstrate how race influences basic functions of our brains. So tell us about it.
Yes, I just had a fascination with how our brains can be shaped by experience, and so that includes social experience and, our culture. Our brain can be shaped by our culture, and so I was interested in what's something called the other race effect, and so this is a phenomenon that researchers have known about for decades now, and it's basically that people are much better at recognizing faces of their own race than they are at recognizing faces of other races. And researchers believe that this has a lot to do with experience. We typically have more experience with sort of people of our own race, and so that can, actually explain some of it. And so we were interested in looking at the neural underpinnings of this, and so with a number of researchers at Stanford, we conducted a neuroimaging study where we put people in a scanner, an imaging scanner, and we showed them the faces of people of their own race, faces of other races, and we just looked at what happened in the brain. And we were very interested in this specific area of the brain called the fusiform face area, or the FFA, and we found that when they were looking at faces of their own race, that area, the neurons in that area were just more active. The neurons were responding more vigorously than if they looked at faces of other races. And so we could see this actually, in the brain, in the area that is implicated in face processing.
And no one had ever done this before?
No one had ever done that before. So we were the first to show that effect.
Wow. Yeah. You describe how facial recognition and race were used by, I love this part, a band of purse snatchers in Oakland.
That's right.
And it's a really good story. So can you kind of summarize it for us?
So this is back in 2014. I was invited to go to Oakland to help the police department there with their reform efforts. And at the time I got there, crime was going down generally across the city.
What year was that?
This was 2014. Yeah. And so crime was going down, but there was a huge spike in crime in Oakland's Chinatown area. And so they were trying to figure out what was going on. And, basically there were a lot of purse snatching. So there were usually middle-aged Chinese women who were walking around, in that area. And these were young, sort of teenage African-American boys that would come along and snatch their purses. So they asked, when they got some of the suspects, the officers would ask them, well, why did you, choose to rob that woman? Why did you, go to this particular neighborhood? And they said, because the Chinese people can't tell the brothers apart. So,
And that was for real, right?
It was for real, yeah. So I was like, wow, do they know about the other race effect, right? So they figured it out. They would rob them, and they could rob them in broad daylight, and they wouldn't be able to ID them. They couldn't really tell one, sort of black face from another. And once they knew this, it was just like a license to steal, basically.
But the purse snatching, did it ever stop? I mean, it stopped, right? So
Yeah, it did stop. But you know how it stopped? They put cameras up, in like all the businesses actually installed these cameras, and so the cameras could do what the women couldn't, and then that's how they solved the crimes.
Wow. And I guess that didn't do much for the relationship between Chinese and African Americans.
No,
in
it
Oakland,
didn't.
didn't it? Wow.
It did not.
Wow. The studies that you have conducted they're innovative, and I found them fascinating. You created studies on something called categorization, and which is grouping categories like things together, in which you describe in your book as a universal function of the brain that allows us to organize and manage the overload stimuli that constantly bombard us. So can you describe one of the studies in this area of categorization and
Yeah, so
what you concluded?
Right. So categorization, it's just a basic function of the brain. We're just bombarded with, information and images and sounds, like everything, right, out in the world. And we need ways to package that. We need ways to organize it, to make sense of it, to give it some kind of coherence so that we can make decisions, so that we can function in the world. And that categorization is, so we categorize everything, first of all. We categorize, furniture and trees and, cars, you name it. And we also categorize people. But once we put people into those categories, we can attach beliefs, about the people who are in that category, and we can attach feelings, about the people that are in that category. So those beliefs are called stereotypes, the feelings are called, sort of our attitudes or the prejudice, and that can actually lead us to treat those people in different ways and to make different decisions about them. But the categorization, really, we need that to function, but it's also a precursor for bias.
So you did a study. Can you name or describe one of the studies?
Yeah, we've done a number of studies on this, including studies that have to do, with this other race effect that I told you about. So, we've done studies where we will show people a face that's racially ambiguous on the computer screen, and we.
So I don't know if it's person is black
or white. Yeah, it just looks kind of like you're not quite sure how to categorize the person. And so then we'll tell them that this person is black or this person is white, and then we would ask them to draw the image of the person on the computer screen, to just look at it while the image stayed up on the screen and try to draw it as accurately as they could, so that someone could, sort of pick out the photograph of the person that you were drawing the image from. And we found that, people would draw the image in a way that was more consistent with the category. So if they saw a face that was racially ambiguous, they would draw an image that was more black if we told them this is a black person. So yes, it's interesting. So I told you about how our experience can, influence how we see one another, how we see faces in particular, but also the categories that we have of each other can kind of distort our perception.
Isn't she awesome?
Yeah.
Crazy. So,
Thank you.
so I'm just curious. I mean, for a typical day in the life of a social psychologist, I mean, do you sit around and kind of, oh, I have an idea for, to study it? I mean, is that how it works? And then because you're very creative.
That is how it works, yeah. It's funny. I used to, when I was an undergraduate, I thought I was going to be an artist, and that's what I went
Really?
to school to do. And I was in design school, and I thought, hey, this isn't creative enough, actually. So I
Interesting.
decided to do
Interesting.
psychology instead. But
Wow. Great. I'm glad you did. So, so you mentioned something in your book called confirmation bias. What is that?
So we have all kinds of biases. I mean, I talk a lot in the book about racial bias, but we have, biases, about all kinds of groups, based on gender and religion and, sexual orientation, class, and so forth. And not only do we have biases about people, we have biases in terms of how we think. And so this confirmation bias is this idea that, we kind of gravitate towards the information that we already believe to be true. So something that's consistent with our prior beliefs, that's the information that we like, and that's the information we remember. That's the information we repeat, and that's the kind of information we search out. We sort of seek out in the world. We're seeking out information that is consistent with what we already believe, and that information that doesn't seem quite consistent, we kind of block that out a little bit. We don't remember it as much. We don't process it as thoroughly.
So confirmation bias can be good or it can be bad, or is it just?
It can be bad, right? Because it kind of sort of puts us in a situation where we're not open anymore. We're not open to new information. We're not open to seeing other perspectives. We're only open to sort of seeking out things that are consistent with our world view, right? So that could be bad, and we can kind of see the evidence of that now, right?
Yes.
In the world. I think social media can make it a lot worse, definitely, because now we can only get fed the information that we already are ready to believe.
Affirms what we believe.
Yeah,
Got
we don't
it.
even have to see information or hear information that's inconsistent with our worldviews.
So one of the many reasons that I love this book is your description of the interactions with your sons, of whom you have three, and how those interactions with your sons informed your research.
Yes.
So there's a story you tell about an incident with one of your sons on a plane.
That's right.
Would you tell us that?
Okay, I'll tell you this story. This is one of my favorite stories. This is when my son was just 5 years old, and he was on a plane with me, and he was just so excited, right, to be on the plane with Mommy, and he's looking all around, and he's checking everyone out on the plane, and he sees this guy, and he says to me, "Hey, that guy looks like Daddy." So I look at the guy, and he didn't look anything at all like my husband, like nothing at all, right? So then I start to look around on the plane. I'm looking, I'm checking everyone out, and I notice that he was the only black guy on the plane. And I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to have a talk with my son about how not all black people look alike, right? So I'm getting ready to have the talk. First of all, you have to adjust the language, right, for a 5-year-old. So I'm trying to adjust the language. I'm getting ready to lecture him. But before I do, I realize that children are different from adults, right? They haven't had years and years of experience where they're kind of shaped to kind of see things in certain ways. And so I thought, well, maybe my child is seeing something that I'm not seeing. Maybe maybe there's some resemblance there that I'm not picking up. And so I look at the guy, and I look at his height, and he was about 4 inches shorter than my husband, so nothing there. I look at his weight, nothing. I look skin color, no resemblance. I look facial features, no resemblance. And then I look at his hair, and he has these long dreadlocks flowing down his back, and my husband shaves his head. And I thought, all right, you're going to get the talk, right? And so I'm about to give him the talk, and just as I, sort of start to do this, he looks at me, and my son says, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And I said, what? What did you say? And he says it again, well, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And I said, well, why would you say that? You know, Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he looked at me and he says, yeah, I know. And I said, well, why would you say that? And he looked at me with this really sad face and he says, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. So we're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next, right? Even with no evildoer, no hatred, this association between blackness and crime made its way into the mind of my 5-year-old.
Wow.
So,
as compelling in the book are the descriptions of your own upbringing and your personal experiences that informed your thinking on bias. And one of those experiences you describe in the book, I've found to be absolutely jaw-dropping. I'm not going to ask you to talk about it. You'll have to read this book because it is absolutely jaw-dropping. In fact, after I read it, I had to close the book and just stop reading for a while. Absolutely. So, can you tell us, without talking about that incident, can you tell us just a little bit about your family and your upbringing?
Yes, so I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm the 5th child of 5. And I grew up in an all-black world until I was 12 years old. And at that point, my parents announced that we were going to move to a nearby suburb called Beechwood. And I didn't know much about Beechwood, but I knew there weren't any black people in Beechwood, at that time. And so I was really nervous, right, about moving there and what was going to happen. I didn't know if I was going to be accepted. And I got there, and I was, accepted just fine. But there were a couple things I could tell you about that. One was that I couldn't tell their faces apart because I had no experience.
For real, you really couldn't?
I could not, no. And I was in a panic about it because I didn't know what was going on. And all of a sudden I lost this ability to be able to recognize faces. I did, and I think that experience kind of led me to be interested as a researcher in face perception, really. So that was one thing. Over time, I was able to recognize those faces. Like I said, it's really about experience. Yeah. I had to kind of train my brain to actually recognize faces that I had no contact with before that time. But I was able to do it, and we're all able to do it, right? It's an experience-driven kind of thing. But the second thing I noticed was huge difference in resources, right? So this was a place where they had, just incredible resources, both in terms of the playing fields and the classrooms, the building, but also, the teachers and what they expected of you and what they expected your future would be like. And so there was all this attention and guidance and this in a way, and resources in a way where I just felt like everything was opening up for me, that I was now on this trajectory where I was expected to go to college, and that was the next step, along the way, where as I wasn't, expected to go to college in my old neighborhood necessarily. And so things were so different, and I felt like they were different in a way that aligned with race, because again, this was an all-white neighborhood. It was very close by. This other neighborhood that I came from, the black neighborhood, was just a bike ride away. But it was like it was a whole world away in terms of just the inequality that I saw there. And it just raised all kinds of questions in my mind about race. And, there are questions that I had then that I just never stopped asking, really, as an adult and as a researcher.
Asking.
Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Wow. From 2015 to 2017, you analyzed footage from 1,000 traffic stops made by 245 officers with the Oakland PD.
Right.
What did you learn?
So this is work that I did in collaboration. It was an interdisciplinary group, and so I'm a social psychologist, but we worked with linguists like Dan Jarofsky, and he's actually the chair of the linguistics department at Stanford, and his graduate students and postdoctoral research associates. So we had a large group of people working on this, and we were really interested in analyzing, the footage to look for patterns. And
Footage of
this is body-worn camera footage.
Right.
So this is, the cameras the footage that comes from the cameras that officers wear. And when we got there, they had had the cameras for about 4 years already, but they really weren't looking at the vast majority of the footage went unexamined. So they would look at the footage if there was an officer-involved shooting, if there was a complaint even, but they didn't really have a system for actually analyzing, just routine traffic stops. And so we wanted to look at these everyday interactions. Most Americans, that's the context under which they come into contact with the police is during a traffic stop. And we wanted to just see, understand what that interaction was like and whether the interaction was different if you were a black driver and stopped versus a white driver. So that's what we looked at. And so we used machine learning techniques to actually be able to analyze this footage.
What do you mean machine learning?
So 1,000 stops, that's a lot for
Right.
any one person
Right.
to analyze, right? And so what we did was we had the footage transcribed, and from those transcripts, we could look for certain words that were associated with respect, having more respect or less respect. And so we were interested in the respect that officers were communicating to the drivers when they were
So
stopped.
it was less the
And so-
visual and more the verbal?
It was the verbal, yeah, and it was the language of the officers in particular. And we knew from linguistics and social psychology and so forth, what words are associated with respect and which aren't, or is less respect. And we found that officers were professional overall, but there was a difference by the race of the driver and the respect.
How so?
They treated black drivers with less respect than white drivers, and they did this throughout the interaction. So it started even with the greeting. So they would greet the person with, if they were.
So for example, how would a disrespectful greeting go?
So a disrespectful greeting would go, "Hey, bro, dude," that kind of thing. African Americans, when that happened, it was African American drivers who received that. White drivers were more likely to receive sir and mister and ma'am and those more formal titles. Yeah. So and then there was less blatant things like they just. For white drivers would offer more reassurance to them during the stop. They would say, it'll be okay, don't worry, that kind of thing.
That's never happened to me.
Me either. I didn't know it happened actually until
It'll be okay.
Yeah, it's funny. So and then at the end of the stop, there was a difference there too. They would express concern for the safety of white drivers more so than black drivers. They, would say, we want you to be safe out there, that kind of thing, before they departed. Less likely to do that with black drivers. So it was in subtle ways and not so subtle ways that we saw differences. And we were just really interested in this because it really can affect how, people think about not just that interaction and that one officer, but about, the police in general. And so it's a site for, for kind of understanding sort of where you stand and just how that interaction, I think, reveals so much about police community relations, really.
Right. You've been teaching police officers to recognize and understand implicit bias for 15 years now. Are you hopeful or are you hopeless or both about policing in America?
Well, it may surprise you, but I'm hopeful.
You are?
Yeah,
Why?
I'm actually quite hopeful. I'm not as hopeful about, the training itself, just sort of, presenting, sort of what we know about implicit bias, or, having a half a day training, or a 2-day training, or what have you. And these trainings are happening all over the country now, right?
It's a
This is-
cottage industry now.
It
really?
is. It is. These, and not just with the police, right? In other workplaces and in schools, and just that's the thing, right?
Yes.
To do. So I'm less hopeful about that, because one reason is just because we haven't, really evaluated how effective those trainings are, and also, I know that it matters more, kind of. Sort of this kind of sort of practicing other ways of doing things, that the norms in the place, in a workplace or in a police department, matter a lot. The practices that they're engaged in, the policies, those things matter a lot. One of the things that I think I'm most proud of in Oakland is that with a number of colleagues, we sat down with members of the department, and we thought about how they can reduce the number of stops of law-abiding, people, community members in Oakland. And we decided that so in Oakland, when they stop someone, when an officer stops someone on the street, they're required to complete a form that says why they made the stop. So they have to say why they made the stop, the location of the stop, the race of the person who was stopped, and so forth. So we added a question to that form, which is this stop intelligence-led, yes or no? And
Intelligence-led.
yeah, and what they mean by that is, do you have sort of credible information or evidence to tie this particular person to a specific crime, basically. And so they had to answer that question and to think about that for each and every stop they made. And so that slows you down, right? And we were trying to have them sort of think about criminal wrongdoing, and sort of discourage them from sort of just using their intuition about who was up to no good, right? And so we found that in 2017, before the addition of this question, there were about 32,000 stops in Oakland, across the city. And in 2018, with the addition of the question, that went down to under 20,000 stops.
Interesting.
We found also that African American stops, so African Americans were disproportionately stopped. So those stops went down by 43%. So a huge difference, right? And they went down at the same time, the crime rate continued to fall. So there was no issue, right, of just like having fewer contacts meant that crime was going to shoot up, which is what they feared. So it was a big win, right? Because
Absolutely.
yeah.
You write about spending time teaching incarcerated men at San Quentin. Can you tell us a bit about that experience?
Yeah, so actually, when I first went to San Quentin to teach a class, I think I had been teaching at Stanford for about 12 years at that point, and I wanted to go to a prison to teach, to talk about, the work that I've been doing on, race and crime, but also to talk to them about social psychology, my field. And so I went there, and it was, I'll never forget this. This was the very first course that I taught there. It was the very first class. It was the first day of class. And like I had done at Stanford for years, I would ask, I asked the men, this is at San Quentin, so it's a male prison, and I would ask them to introduce themselves and to say why it is that they wanted to take the class. And just like at Stanford, some of the answers were similar, like, they thought the course would be interesting, or, they needed the course for credit, for, a requirement, that happens a lot.
Right.
But there are also answers that I just never heard before. So, for example, one man, he said that he was taking the course because his daughter was depressed, and he was worried about her, and he thought that taking a class in psychology might, help him to talk to her and to, help her through it. And then there was a guy who I think was about in his 40, I think he was around 45 or so. He said that he was taking the course because he understood how things worked inside San Quentin. He kind of knew the rules and all of that, and he really understood the place. But he wanted to take the course because he wanted to understand. He says, I want to understand how free people think. And I thought, wow, he had been incarcerated since he was 14 years old, and he was 45 now, right? So he spent his entire adult life in prison, and he was just desperate to understand how prison had kind of warped his view of things and how it had shaped him. And it was just, at that moment, I just thought, wow, I felt like, I had come to the prison because, we were all kind of shackled by, the societal beliefs about men like him, right? And men like him, they're dehumanized, they're discarded, and I felt like I was there actually to move a little closer to freedom as well.
Wow.
So yeah.
It's amazing. Wow. Was he African American?
No,
was not.
he wasn't. He was Filipino.
Wow.
Yeah.
Since he was 14. Wow.
Yes, 14 years old. So we've done studies on this that are actually similar to the kinds of studies that we've done on race and crime. So a lot of this work was with the former graduate student, Philip Goff, and we were interested in the power of this association, even though, people, don't, it's not association that people admit to. I think that people will, it's sort of clear that people have been exposed to this association between African Americans and crime. But this is an association, at least, a number of years ago when we were doing the research, that people, professed no knowledge of. And so we were interested in, how it could still be, something that has resonance, that it could still be gripping us and influencing us in various ways. And so we did these studies, like, for example, where we would have people sit in front of a computer screen, and we would expose them to, to faces of African Americans.
Were these students?
These were students at Stanford and at UC Berkeley.
Okay.
Yeah, and we would expose them to faces of African Americans or expose them to faces of white Americans, and then we would, show them a blurry image of an ape, and slowly that image would get clearer and clearer. And we found that if they'd been exposed to African American faces beforehand, they could tell us what that image was sooner. So they needed less clarity before they could say, "Oh, that's an ape. That's a gorilla or
Right.
an orangutan," and so forth. So
And-
we showed it in lots of ways. Actually, that's one example.
Wow. And so those who were less familiar with black faces, took longer to?
So what the finding was is that those who had been exposed to the
Yeah.
black faces, they could tell that blurry image was an image of an ape sooner than those who had been exposed to white faces. We've also done it in other ways. I mean, that's one example, but we we did lots of these studies using lots of different methodologies, and every time we found evidence for this association between African Americans and apes, and we even found how that association can influence people's, there's just their support for, police violence directed at African Americans. So, for example, just showing people, ape imagery before they watch a video of a group of police officers who are sort of using force on an African American person. Just having that ape imagery in their mind led them to believe that use of force was necessary, that the person brought it on himself, and so forth. So,
Wow.
yeah, it was pretty. And the other thing that surprised us was that association seemed like it was stronger than the association between African Americans and crime. So it was,
Interesting.
it was quite eye-opening. So.
You did some work with Nextdoor. That's the online platform for sharing information with nearby neighbors.
Yes.
What was all that about?
So, so next door, like you said, I mean, their whole thing is to bring people together to create, happier and safer and, neighborhoods where, people are, friendly to each other and all of that. And so they wanted to create this space where people could gather and share information, but they had a problem with racial profiling on the platform. So, you typically someone would look outside their window and they would see a black person in an otherwise white neighborhood. They would get nervous. They would start to use Nextdoor to contact all the neighbors to say, hey, suspicious person in the neighborhood. They would sometimes call the police and so forth. And so they were just alarmed at this. So one of the co-founders, Sarah Leary, reached out to me. She knew I studied bias. I'm right down the street. Their headquarters actually is in San Francisco. And so she wanted to talk about, well, how do we curb profiling on the platform? And from talking to me and others and pouring through the literature, she learned that one way to curb bias is to slow people down. Like, we're more likely to act on bias when we don't have time to think things through. We don't have time to reflect, right? We're just having to make split-second decisions. And these well-practiced associations, right? This Black Crime Association can kind of leap forward and affect our decision-making in those circumstances. So they wanted to slow people down.
So how did you slow them down?
So what they did was to develop a checklist. It was a 3-item checklist, and so before you're able to just say suspicious person and shout out to all their neighbors, you had to look and sort of at 3 questions. And one is, what is it about this person's behavior that's suspicious? So it can't be a social category, right? It can't be suspicious black man, right? And so it had to be a behavior. What is he doing that's suspicious? The second thing was to describe the person in enough detail that you don't capture a whole group, right? So you're wanting to describe this person, their individual features, so other people weren't harmed by the description. And then the third item on that checklist was to explain what racial profiling was, because it turns out that not everybody understood. They didn't have a definition for racial profiling, so they didn't understand what it was or that they were engaging in it. And so they gave them a definition, and then they told them that it was prohibited on the platform. So this is another way in which you can mitigate biases by, having cultural norms in a space that say that we're against this, we won't allow this, and so forth. And so, using that checklist, they were able to curb profiling by over 75% on the platform.
Wow.
It's kind of simple technique here, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I think it's significant that the founder reached out, realized I need to do something here, and was proactive.
Right. And that's the other thing I'll say about that is, like, oftentimes people think about bias as an individual thing. It's something that we're kind of wrestling with on our own, and we want to, figure out how to sort of put the brakes on bias or mitigate bias for ourselves. But I think sort of our institutions, or our companies or corporations, and our schools, and so our institutions play a role here. It's not just us as individuals, that they have responsibility for this as well. And the thing about Nextdoor is that they are in 95% of the neighborhoods now in the U.S. And so when they are trying to make a difference here, I mean, they can make a huge difference for millions of people. And so by just putting that checklist up there, they're kind of changing the mindset, right, of all of these people. And so that's a good thing.
Fantastic. I sometimes hear white people say, oh, I don't see color. And when the subject of race comes up, no, I don't see color. And I cringe, every time I hear it. Do you cringe? And if you do, what's the problem with this line of thinking, I don't see color?
Right. First, tell me, why do you cringe?
Oh, I'm asking the question. It makes me feel very uncomfortable because it's obvious. I mean, I know who I am and I know what I look like. How can you not see
Yeah.
me? So
Right. So you feel like you're not seen.
exactly, and like not
Right.
seeing me.
Right, right. Yeah, so there's that. I guess I cringe for that reason as well. But also as a researcher, we find that, just, trying to motivate people to be colorblind actually is not helpful. And in some ways, it can lead to more bias. It can lead to more discrimination. So there's research on this as well. They've done research, for example, at elementary schools where they'll take fourth and fifth graders and they'll tell them, we all believe in racial equality. The best way to, achieve that is to be colorblind. Or they took these students and said, we all believe in racial equality. The best, to be a good person basically is to value diversity. So they got opposite messages. And then they were exposed to this child who knocked a black kid down on a soccer field, and the child was asked, "Why did you knock him down?" And I think he punched him or something. And the kid said, "Well, I did it because he's black, and black people are aggressive, and I don't like black people." That kind of thing, right? Pretty blatant.
Right.
And so the finding is that when they asked the children about whether this was discrimination or not, they found that those who were told to value diversity, the vast majority of them saw it as discriminatory. But when they asked the children who were told that colorblindness is the way to go, only half of them actually saw that incident as discriminatory. And so the finding is that when they're told not to see color, it's not. They also don't see discrimination. And if the whole idea behind colorblindness, right, is to try to to fight inequality, what the finding is that, people aren't fighting the inequality, when they don't see color, because they don't see the inequality either. And so it actually makes us everything worse off.
Got
Yeah.
it. So what do you say to somebody? You're in a conversation with someone who's white, says, "Well, I don't see color." What's the proper kind of response? Like, go read Jennifer's book.
Yeah. I mean, definitely, a lot of people are taught that. I think teachers, teach students that in school. Researchers have shown by the age of 10, 10 years old, children already know that it's not proper, it's not polite to mention someone's race, and so, so it's just a real problem because. So there's the issue of not seeing inequality, but there's also an issue of just not knowing how to talk about race, right? So if you can't see color, that means you can't really talk about race, and then we grow up and we become adults and we have all these issues, but then we're actually not able to talk about it. We don't have the language to talk about it. We don't have practice, talking about this with each other. We're uncomfortable when the subject comes up, and so it's that's not helpful. Yeah, right?
Right, exactly. So in the book, you tell some of these wonderful stories about people that you met in your journey in writing the book. Some of them you met when you went to Charlottesville.
Yeah.
It was the summer of 2017, the summer of
right.
hate. Why did you go to Charlottesville? And just briefly, because we're going to take some audience questions, what did you learn?
Yeah, so I went there because I wanted to understand how that summer of hate, how the Unite the Right March, how it affected people on the college campus, on UVA's campus, the University of Virginia. And I wanted to understand how that affected, students and professors, both inside and outside the classroom. I wanted to sort of understand how they were trying to move forward, how it affected, racial climate and so forth. So that's why I went. And when I went, it's interesting. I thought, I was going to kind of start understanding this and learning more once I reached the campus. But it turned out as soon as I got off the plane, when I was still at the airport, I was already getting a lesson, right?
Right.
I
Remember the story. The story.
at the airport, I hopped into an Uber to get to the campus, and the first thing the Uber driver says to me is, "So what brought you to town?" Right? And I thought, whoa, because I was thinking about it, right? Because should I, talk about, this book that I'm writing? Should I talk about racial bias? So the Uber driver was a middle-aged guy. He was white. We were in the South. I was nervous. I wasn't sure if he was, part of the march or if he was. I didn't know what side he was on.
Right.
And so in a way, it was like my own bias, right? Kind of leaping forward because I didn't know who this person was.
Did he have a
And
Southern accent? and
he
all that
did.
Southern
He
twang?
did.
Yep.
He had a Southern accent, but that doesn't mean that he
Right.
was marching.
Right, right, right.
That doesn't make him a white supremacist. But I was nervous,
Right.
because of his category again,
Yeah.
that he might be. And then I caught myself, and I thought, well, no, I'm gonna talk to him. I'm going to tell him why I'm here. And so, I said, hey, I'm here to, I'm working on this book on racial bias. I'm here to talk to people about what happened here this summer. And he just launched into this. We had this conversation about the person who helped to raise him. The person who was almost like a mother to him was a domestic worker. She was a black woman who was the person, he said, that one of the people he loved most in the world. And he started sort of talking to me about her and the fond memories that he had of her, and he was like kind of tearing up even. Well, I heard that I was in the back, but just his voice would kind of shake at times. And it turned out that she had just passed away, and so this was kind of fresh and raw for him. And so I'm relaxing, right, the whole
Yeah.
time. He's talking about
You're safe.
loving this black
Yeah.
woman, right? So and then the tone his tone changed, and he stopped talking, and then he announces, he says, "There's bigotry in my veins," and I thought, whoa, bigotry in your veins, and I thought, well, when do you feel it? Like I'm in the back seat. I'm like, well.
Oh, dear.
And he thought about it, and he says, I feel it when I'm outnumbered. I could feel it rising up. And he says, if he's the only white person in an otherwise black space. And he'd also spent some time in Florida, and he said it wasn't just with African Americans. If he was, in an environment where he was surrounded by, Latinos, that he would feel it there too. And it was just really interesting because that conversation set the tone for my visit there, because a lot of the the Unite the Right March, the whole pull towards white supremacy, right, is this feeling of white genocide. It's the feeling of losing your standing in the world, of being outnumbered, basically. And he's telling me that that's when he felt the bias rise up, was when he was outnumbered. So, yeah.
You have so many of these good stories that are in the book. It's just intriguing as you put, your research together. They're just terrific. So we have so many questions here, and unfortunately we're not going to get through all of them, but let me start. What did you think about how Starbucks handled its response to the incident where two black men went into the Starbucks in Philadelphia, and before they knew it, they were handcuffed for waiting while black?
Right.
So what's your...
Waiting without using the bathroom while black.
yes. Yes.
They wanted to use the
That's
bathroom, waiting without purchasing
Got it.
something while black. Yeah, that was, as we know, Starbucks decided to really confront this directly, right? They, closed all of their stores, across the country, and had this implicit bias training. And it was a statement, in a positive way, it was a statement, right, that they took this seriously, that they cared about it, that it was a statement about what they stood for and what they valued, all of that. But we don't know whether that training was effective. We don't know if it was effective for how long. We don't know a lot, about whether that made the difference in terms of actual sort of interactions, with the public.
So just doing the training is not enough. There has to be
No.
you have to measure outcomes, and that's not being done.
Well, you have to measure outcomes. That's not being done, but also you have to, approach it from a lot of different angles, from different directions. So the training could be one thing, but you also have to, look at, policies. They actually did change their bathroom policy
they
after
did.
that incident, so that that you didn't have to, actually pay for something before you use the bathroom. So you have to look at how you can change your practices. Again, so we were talking about how bias is not something that's just in one person's head, right? It's something that the environment that you're in can give rise to. And so that's why it's really important in our workplaces, in our schools, right? When we're in these environments, there's a lot of control leadership, people in positions of power have,
Right.
over what kind of environment we're in. And so that can influence whether we're going to, whether that's going to trigger bias and whether we're going to act on that bias.
Got it.
So that's vital.
Right.
I think oftentimes people think that if either you're biased or you're not, but bias is something that really, it's something we're all vulnerable to, but it's something that is situationally triggered.
Got it.
So, and just knowing that gives us a lot of control over it. It gives us some power over whether we're going to let it affect our decisions and our actions.
Wow. Can you talk about the role of bias in relation to healthcare?
Yeah, I didn't talk about that much
Right.
in the book. I devoted chapters, say, to looking at bias in our neighborhoods and then in our schools and in our workplaces, in our criminal justice system. I don't know, the disparities that we see in health and in healthcare are just really, really, just strong and depressing. And there's not a lot of. I feel like in that situation, I'm almost kind of almost less hopeful
Really?
about that than I am sort of. Even with the police, because people don't have a sense of what's producing the disparity there. They don't have a sense about sort of what to do to sort of close, the gaps, the racial gaps that we see in healthcare and so
Right.
forth. So. It would be interesting, for example, to look there even at, we looked at police-community interactions in Oakland and looked at camera footage to try to get a handle on that. It would be interesting to do that in the healthcare environment with doctors and patients to
Right.
try to understand how those interactions go.
Is
And
that an area you think you might?
yeah, I would love to go in that
Do that?
direction, actually.
Good.
So.
Good.
Yeah.
So here's another one. It says, it makes me wonder how many people of color have been wrongly imprisoned because of biased identification by eyewitnesses. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts about that?
Yes. So there are a lot of people who are interested in that, right? There's I'm blanking. Oh, the Innocence Project. That's the name I'm trying to think of. So there's there are people there who are actually tracking this and looking at it and looking at wrongful imprisonment, especially looking at death sentencing, for
Yes,
example.
right.
And lots of people have been exonerated through DNA evidence, but a lot of those people were, sent to prison and even on death row on the basis of, this eyewitness testimony, or at least that played a pivotal role, because people believe that you know, you should be, especially in a situation like that, that people wouldn't forget that face, right, of this person who has done this. But it turns out that people can, and especially cross-racial identifications, you know, they're a lot harder than intra-racial identifications, and so you see that there too.
Yeah.
So if you add up, you know, the people who were falsely imprisoned due to, you know, the eyewitness testimony, and then also false confessions. It's more than, you know, it's more than half. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's the majority.
So we have now come to the end of our program. And I thank you so much. And what I'd like to do, I think that the perfect ending to our time together is there's this touching passage in Bias, and it's on pages 7 and 8. And I think it would be perfect if you would, for all of us, read to us, if you wouldn't mind, that passage, and we'll close our program with that.
Okay.
All right?
I have to put on my glasses.
All right.
Okay. Confronting implicit bias requires us to look in the mirror. To understand the influence of implicit racial bias requires us to stare into our own eyes, to face how readily stereotypes and unconscious associations can shape our reality. By acknowledging this distorting lens of fear and bias, we move one step closer to clearly seeing each other. And we move one step closer to clearly seeing the social harms, the devastation that bias can leave in its wake. Neither our evolutionary path nor our present culture dooms us to be held hostage by bias. Change requires a kind of open-minded attention that is well within our reach. This book is a representation of the journey I have taken, the unexpected findings I have uncovered, the stories I have heard, the struggles I have encountered, and the triumphs I have been buttressed by. I invite you to join me.
Thank you. You're awesome.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
I hope that you all enjoyed this evening's program, brought to you by the Commonwealth Club of Silicon Valley. And again, we'd like to thank so much Jennifer Eberhardt, author of Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do, and our audience here in Palo Alto, and those of you joining us on the radio and on the web. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
You're going to sign books.
Where should I
Over there.